Hey everybody, this is Josh Schachnow for another episode of the Canadian Immigration Pros podcast. I am very excited today to be joined by Naumaan Hameed. Naumaan, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to having a good discussion with you today, Josh.
Likewise, and as we were quickly discussing before the recording, it's been another few crazy weeks, really crazy year in terms of changes from Immigration Canada. And one of the reasons why I'm very excited to chat with you is to spend a little bit more time talking about immigration for entrepreneurs. There's been some big changes in a lot of the different programs for them. So I'm looking forward to discussing that. Before we jump in, can you give a little bit of an introduction, a little bit more about who you are and what you've done over the last, while now?
Sure. Yeah. I got involved in immigration early in my career. I was originally kind of passionate about immigration. I was dabbling a bit in law school, did an intensive program at Osgood, and that got me sort of going into the motion of immigration. I did some work in South Africa for 3 years with the UNHCR, some really cool stuff with international judges, figuring out human rights regimes over there. Eventually, I came back and then I had my own practice for a number of years and then really pivoted into corporate immigration with a number of accounting firms. And then myself and my current business partner, Howard Greenberg, created Greenberg Hameed about 3 years ago and providing exactly what we're going to talk about now, like really specialized services for corporations and entrepreneurs to navigate choppy waters these days.
Absolutely. That's putting it lightly. So we'll dive into more details. Before we kind of get into the nuances, can I just ask you, where is your head at today? Given and I'll make this, I'll date us quickly. We're recording this on October 11th, 2024. The episode will probably go live next week. And 2024 has just been a crazy ride in Canadian immigration. Generally speaking, at the 30,000 foot view, where's your head at? What are your thoughts before we go into like more nuanced programs and stuff like that?
For sure. About a year ago, I did one session, right, with a cross-border organization. And I said, I predict that there will be a lot of turbulence, right? It's much more turbulent than I thought. It's like the plane shaking up and down, right? It makes me a little distraught because what I think we're seeing is massive overreaction. I think, yes, absolutely. Some of the policies were ill-conceived around the students. For example, we let in too many of the wrong people. Wasn't fair for them. It was really lacking guardrails. And then we've also seen, back in the time where we're really looking for talent post-COVID, we really opened up the doors, right? And I think there was such a thirst to get back into the economy that, there was an enthusiasm that was uncurbed and uncontrolled. And the discussion was so much pro Canada that it was kind of exciting at that time because we just saw so much opportunity. And then politically, because things have changed, it's just such an extreme reaction that my concern is really for my clients. A large number of clients that have great prospects are really starting to hesitate now. Like, do I make this investment in Canada? Everything I see is as to why we are not really welcoming immigrants anymore. Should I set up my business there? And we'll talk about that. It's become even tighter. And then my heart goes out for the entrepreneur who's really keen and had this Canadian dream. They didn't like the feeling of the US. Canada was the place to be. And right now we're getting this negative sentiment, which is really disappointing, like being in the middle of it. That's how I currently feel. But, for both you and I in the industry, never been a need for people who can really give good counsel because it's extremely difficult. You can't dabble in this anymore.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I've been saying a lot of the same stuff as well on LinkedIn and on the podcast about how I think it's a clear case of a big pendulum. It was way too far to one side for years in terms of open door and not much regulation. Now it's swung all the way to the other side and everything's being capped and restricted. And I have a similar concern. Is this drastically going to hurt brand Canada to the point where the best and brightest that we actually do want to attract and need might not consider Canada anymore, which I think would be very scary. Now, let's take a little bit of I wanted to put a specific lens on this episode. Usually what we do on the podcast is we pick one or two programs and go kind of deep onto those topics, which a lot of the immigration professionals and aspiring immigrants appreciate, especially as you said these days, because it's been so crazy.
Right.
So let's put on the cap of entrepreneurs considering coming to Canada. Maybe they have a business they want to expand. Maybe they've sold a business, they're interested in buying, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about, broadly speaking, and then we'll dive deeper, what are some of the best options, or maybe what were some of the best options within the last 2-3 years for entrepreneurs to come to Canada, and how have things changed?
Right. So let's kind of take a step back and look. Normally, when you're talking to an entrepreneur, you're looking at what their genuine interests are and what their intentions are. In some instances, companies are looking to expand to Canada. They're very entrepreneurial. They see Canada as being a destination where they can expand their current services, differentiate in the market. It's an expansion play, but they may not, in fact, necessarily want to themselves be in Canada. They might want to just set a business up. And so for the longest time, when they had a really strong fundamental business, good revenue flow, great services, maybe a little bit of interest and traction to Canada, then the intercompany transfer was a great alternative. Start the new business. You probably know who your executive is that's going to launch that business. You'll move some of your specialized knowledge workers in to grow, and you'll hire Canadians, and off you go. We had like one of our really large clients. They started off with employee number one, right? Many, many years ago, and they're up to 1,000, right? That's the story. And many of those people are Canadian. So I'm always looking, I was, right? And I'll have to rethink depending on which country they're in now, because the way the rules work has a different sort of application. We can get into that. But that's one opportunity. It's low hanging fruit. And then you get the other individual, who says, look, I always been an entrepreneur. Usually these people are a little bit more mature. They've had a little bit more tread on the tire, right? And they're saying, for personal reasons, I'm a business person. I'd love to do business in Canada. It sounds great. I've got a lot of skills. What can I do? And so before all these changes came into play, you would look at, first thing would be, hey, are you an innovative person? What are you up to? Sometimes they're doing something really amazing. I had 5 people in India that had developed a strategy where they were able to use new technology to do various detection of pediatric cardiac issues, right? Using technology. And it was tested in the Apollo hospitals. 100 of the hospitals were already adopting it because everything's, on steroids in India. So that was a great company. When we talked to them, they had the dream of Canada, but great setup for the startup visa program because highly innovative. This particular group, they were a little different. They're a little younger. But that was a door that was open. We'll talk about that. And that door was wide open, again, probably too far wide open. And so many companies would come in. There was enthusiasm all over about that program. Occasionally, we've got some people who say, hey, Naumaan, I'm kind of not sure about this whole US thing. Maybe I'll come and kind of be entrepreneurial in Canada, but I don't want to kind of jump in the pool. I want to put my foot in the pool for a little while. So I don't know if I want PR, but I want to kind of feel out Canada. So for example, if you're a director in Hollywood, or maybe you're looking at the World Cup that's coming up and you say, hey, I provide a really interesting service. Let me test the waters, but I'm going to be a self-owned operated business. Then I'd look at a C11, right? Which is unfortunately for an owner operator, that's really limited options. They closed the owner operator LMIA a number of years ago. There isn't a way to transition under the self-employed class anymore for PR. But for that person who says, let me test the waters for a limited time, you've got that category. And then lastly, you do have the provincial nominee programs, and there could be an entrepreneur program. But usually after I explain to a client, what's involved, they scratch their head and say, isn't that program designed backwards? Like I'm supposed to come in, buy the business on a work permit, and then I get PR. Well, why would I do that? I say, I really don't know. So those are the options we're playing with right now. A little bit to your point, a little bit sad because some of the people I've met are amazing business people, and they really don't have a way to stay, right? And that's all different levels, from like the corporate play to like the more conventional business. I just met like a head chef, Michelin chef. He makes amazing food. He's got a new operation here, and he's generating about $500,000 a month. He's got 40 employees. He won't qualify for express entry. And he's saying, well, I came in here on an intra-company transfer. What do I do now? And I'm
Yeah.
saying, well, yeah, I've got to look at certain programs now, and you're going to have to wait to qualify provincially maybe. But that person should be in here, I mean, quickly. So there's a gap.
Yeah.
That's sort of the discussion that's happening these days at different levels.
Yeah. And such a shame, as you said, because, the overcorrection is really making it harder for everybody. I mean, like you said too, and I really like how you kind of set the stage at the beginning of the episode, which is we still need people. This overcorrection, yes, some people, some programs needed to be reduced and limited, et cetera, et cetera. But this overcorrection, it's hurting the people that we need the most right now, right? The economy's hurting a bit. We need these entrepreneurs to come in and create jobs and grow the economy and help with GDP, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to do a quick summary of what you mentioned, which was number one, maybe not necessarily in order, startup visa, PNPs for entrepreneurs, ICT, and C11 work permit. And that's great. Can you talk a little bit how those have been affected, some of them more so than others over the last couple of years? And maybe what would also be interesting is obviously it's a little bit of situational, right? Who is this entrepreneur? What's their background? What's their current situation? But which ones of those four are you most bullish on, or maybe suggesting the most right now?
So let's give a little context, and it helps the discussion. It's a storyline. Everything in immigration is a storyline. When that owner operator program in the LMIA system was closed, many entrepreneurs looking at the PNP, which is a very labor intensive process, you've got to come and make a visit. You've got to demonstrate to the provincial government that your business is one of their eligible businesses. And even if it's not excluded on the list, sometimes they'll say, you know what, Josh, we don't really like your business. Try something else, come back to us. So there's no guarantee. And it's got many layers of processes involved and financial commitment and challenge, like even coming for the visit. I mean, you file your visitor visa and AI catches you and knocks you out because you're in a high profile country. You're not even getting to step one, right? So many reasons. And then trying to move your money in and trying to convince a seller you're going to buy and you don't even have status, and trying to finance. So that program was never really, and it never really has been highly desirable, except for people really didn't have another option. So I saw a lot of entrepreneurs after that owner operator starting to pivot to SUV. And to your point, probably the way the industry lacked regulation and regulatory oversight of the designated entities, there was a lot of, processes that lacked integrity, for lack of a better sense. So it didn't mean that the right people came in, but a lot of people came in that way. The ICT provisions have always been very welcomed for established businesses. So I can tell you, during the Trump administration and thereafter, Canada was seen as very attractive. And so if I had even a smaller corporate business, as long as I had enough revenue to demonstrate that I can pay all of my people and have enough money to expand, even for a smaller entrepreneur, there was room if one could demonstrate a reasonable business plan, a market strategy, to be able to grow into Canada. So that option was still, like I would say, very popular, even to a certain extent. If you had a great idea and money and it was innovative, the global talent street was potentially on the table. Now, a lot of that in each one of these categories was subject to the discretion and interpretation of the officer as to what were the objectives of these categories. And at that time, it was rah Canada. We need people. We need innovation. We need capital and money. So you could skillfully, with the right circumstances, find multiple pathways. And as we know, where the individual is thinking about PR, well, if it's a CEO coming in to lead the operation, then they could be eligible for 200 points. So it also set them up for PR, right? So that was the thinking when the economy was wide open and hungry. Now, as the dial has turned the other way, what we see in the most recent changes everywhere, like we've seen business programs for entrepreneurs provincially close temporarily. we've seen, I know there are 3 provinces actively rethinking how do we recalibrate our program because they don't work. And what should we be doing? Because federally, when the numbers go down, which they will in November, there'll be less immigrants. So provincially, we have to pinpoint exactly who we need because we're not going to get them probably federally. So they're recalibrating. We know that
Hmm.
there's like a cap in the SUV. So that's reduced that inventory. And then, we can get into some of the details, but the ICT, and I know we had an earlier discussion where I said, I'm telling you, Josh, they're going to narrow that ICT significantly. And I think what they saw was there were a lot of companies, as I just described, that were smaller, right? And they were starting because the SUV was capped and the PNPs are closing. When everything else closes, it's like pushing the forces together. They go in one direction. And we've seen this with the ICT in 2010. There used to be an exemption for a software pilot program. And when that closed, there was a massive bubble that went into the ICT. And that's where we saw a similar kind of recalibration or operational guidance. That was 2010, the last time we saw something like we saw this week on October 3rd, which is now they're saying, really, unless you're operating in 2 different countries, and they discourage, they say it's not really intended, right, for an owner operator family business. And they give a little exception there, unless you're a multinational corporation, which is, we're not really sure what that means. But what they're really doing is discouraging that small player from being in one country, expanding to Canada and coming in because they really don't want, I think they've seen a lot of applications where people were doing that and they really sensed that it was really more of a ploy to get that work permit and try to get the PR. So again, a few bad actors kind of spoil the policy for everybody else. And I think that's what we're seeing is this trend of narrowing, and it impacts the corporates too, because now we see a lot of the additional requirements, which originally the revisions might have been intended to catch the smaller players. Now it impacts everyone. So
Yeah.
that's in a nutshell, sort of how the evolution of like wide open to very narrow has occurred.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to give some credit to Naumaan, who did call this ICT change coming a couple weeks ahead as we were chatting. And I said, we need these ICT owners. And he said, Josh, something's coming. And I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks later, and it did. So kudos to you.
Mm.
And so I want to know, what are your thoughts? So just to kind of brief everybody, earlier this year or maybe end of last year, they capped startup visa. And as you mentioned, a lot of the PNPs have changed. Ontario closed their entrepreneurial stream entirely. Who knows when that'll come back?
Yeah.
And so ICT, earlier this month, they made a change wherein, in order to be eligible, you can't just have a company with offices in one country abroad in order to expand into Canada. Your company has to be operating in at least 2 countries outside Canada in order to expand into Canada. What are your thoughts on the change? Good, bad, ugly?
I think often immigration introduces rules and it's a blunt instrument instead of being more thoughtful to try to identify what are they really trying to deter. So
Hmm.
my first impression is in the US, you wouldn't see the same type of carve out where you have to be operating. And in fact, in many other regions around the world. So Canada's trying to get this reputation as being really tough, right? So
Yeah.
for example, if they didn't like the idea of smaller companies being able to expand to Canada, maybe there should have been some threshold in terms of like for a smaller company, what type of economic performance or strength of business do they need to demonstrate? Why not focus more on that? So the disadvantage here is let's assume that there's a company in India, for example, and they've started a new business and it's taken off like wildfire and they're creating jobs and they've got a lot of revenue. And it was a successful, husband and wife that created the business. And now they've got other people involved and it's growing. Do we simply want to say, go to another country first and create a bunch of more jobs and then come to us? Like, does that make
Hmm.
sense in a category that's supposed to facilitate trade and development? So I would have liked more thoughtfulness in terms of creating the rule, because simply saying that by working in 2 countries makes you more genuine than working in one is just too simple a statement in my mind. So that was my
Yeah.
initial impression. And then they've layered in a lot of other provisions that apply, and it's important, when you're reading these changes that we have our regulation 205 intercompany transfer, right? Which applies generally, general agreement trades and services. And then Canada negotiates in many cases separate agreements with various countries, like with the US and Mexico. And we see that in other regions in the EU. And so you have to actually read each agreement, and you'll see that some of these changes do apply, but the multinational corporation provision does not appear in the trade agreements. So depending on where you're from, your citizenship, there's a different application of rules, right? So again, there are certain countries where we don't have a preferential trading agreement where that entrepreneur will be disadvantaged if they're, based on those provisions. And then some of the other rules that have been introduced just make it more onerous for a corporation to transfer workers. Like they've introduced a new rule that you must keep the same capacity, the job. And instead of saying, traditionally the rule is you need to have worked for 1 out of 3 years, be currently employed in a similar position. But then they add a new bullet underneath that says that you must be in, the job abroad must be available at the end of your assignment in the same capacity. And so some of
Hmm.
the jobs that we see, like in more innovative areas, they constantly change. Like there's iterations. And so again, they've created pretty traditional rules. Some of them are acceptable. Like after the pandemic, there wasn't really clarity on what remote work means. Like how often do you have to be in a corporate office or at a client site as opposed to home? And so I think some of these changes are reasonable to say that if you're doing an intercompany transfer, you must have some commercial premise. You can't be like, totally void in the Canadian market because you should be continuously supervising, right? Directing and supervising. But there's a tightening. So when I look at the Canadian ICT now, if you measure it in theory against the L1B, ours is a harder test, right? Now, you would find
Hmm.
in the past for practitioners that do a high volume and they've been exposed to the US and Canada, you'd find the approval rate on ICTs were like 95% if you know what you're doing, right? It's like very rarely do you find a refusal. But L1Bs are like, especially from India, at one point I remember clients were saying like 35% approval. But when you
Hmm.
actually look at what's required, much more detailed in Canada than the US. So,
Right.
these are pretty monumental changes. Like I would say from my experience, it's only every 10 years that there's a major pivot on something like the ICT in between little tweaking. But this is a major pivot that we'll have to watch. And then, in the guidelines, a whole page of instructing the officer if you're going to refuse, how to refuse with great detail was like kind of like a back premonition. Like you're already getting ready to make sure this is refused in a proper way. So let's see what happens when we actually get some volume through the system as to how they interpret this.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to track, and I totally agree. I mean, sure, if you want to clamp down on the bad actors, I think we can all agree that's a good thing. But if you have, as you said, what started as a mom and pop shop in India, and maybe it turns into a 50, 100 person business, and now they want to expand to start tackling America, and they want Canada to be their first landing spot, is that not exactly who we want? Like the
Mm.
types of people that are going to land, they're going to hire right away, they're going to help the economy. Anyways, I digress. I'm
Well,
preaching to the choir
Josh,
here.
on that point, you raise a good point. When they talk about that scenario indirectly in the memorandum, then it says that, these scenarios would not apply or be appropriate for the ICT. Please refer, they may be eligible for C11. Now, the problem there is C11 is supposed to be for truly a seasonal or temporary type of business, or it's economic, but you have to demonstrate an exit strategy. So how do you
Hmm.
explain to that business that, yes, let's grow your business in Canada, but by the way, after you convince an EDC to do a letter of support that you're great, let's find a Canadian who you can sell your business to so that then you can demonstrate you're going to leave. Like it doesn't make any sense, right? So again, to
Yeah.
answer your first question, I think we have to think about, with policy, it helps when they do more stakeholder feedback. Like the Global Talent Stream, which is probably my favorite program in Canada, we had initiated with some of our clients an initial discussion where we said, here are the challenges. And then they took the ball and they went and talked to everyone. And they really made an
Mhm.
informed decision. This is political. Like there's a lot of pressure on the minister and the department, and they're making decisions fast. But I don't think they thought through what the bigger economic impact is. It's going to be pretty painful in some instances.
Yeah, yeah. And I completely agree as well with your suggestion of why would the number of countries be the deciding factor? Why not something like revenue or number of employees? So, if you want to detract the person who basically just starts a business purely for immigration, just set a revenue minimum or a number of employees minimum or something like
Right.
that. So
Yeah.
anyways, that would have been much better. I think definitely something consistent I've heard from consultants and lawyers across the country over the last year or two is there are so many smart, experienced consultants and lawyers who have plenty of great opinions on how we could do this a little bit more effectively. And if there was more of an open conversation, I think everybody would be for the better. So Naman, let me ask you this. Let's say you get a call today from that exact situation, right? It's maybe a husband and wife. They're based in India. 5 years ago, they started a business. They built it up. They've got 75 employees, whatever, 50, 75 employees. They're doing maybe a couple million a year. They want to expand into North America. They let's assume that their first priority is Canada. What are you recommending to them these days?
So in a situation where we know that that multinational corporation rule applies, right? And they don't have that capability. First thing I'm looking at is, well, what's on the horizon for your business? And it's more of a business discussion. At what point do you want to take advantage of what you see as opportunities to grow your business in Canada? And are there any other countries on the horizon? Because I am thinking if they're thinking about an expansion, and the expansion, as I read through it, and I should read it through again, it didn't talk about the duration of establishment in the other country, I don't believe. So, I mean, you have to be actively doing business. But if they're
Mhm.
really doing an amazing job and they're about to expand, I would still sort of have that discussion to see, do we park the ICT? Because I just kind of prefer that before I start talking about any of these other more convoluted options, right? Um,
Right.
there's also, like they haven't touched this yet. And I say that, and probably next thing we know, that could be, you know, when the company is doing something amazing and they're unique and there's revenue, and if they can demonstrate that they're going to hire a lot of Canadians, maybe let's say the company is doing something in AI, or they're going to create a bunch of new jobs in an area, like they're going to innovate healthcare, which we know is under, siege right now. There could be an argument. I've done a number of them. Maybe I'll have to do more where I try a C10, a significant economic benefit argument, which is that there's something kind of amazing going on here. There's something unique about these individuals, distinguished, and that the economic impact of this company coming into Canada is such that it's going to help, Canadians socially, in terms of if it was a case of advancing healthcare in Canada, the innovation, how that would help Canadians if we're going to create a number of jobs. So I would think you gotta put your thinking cap on now, because the
Mhm.
other options are probably just not going to work. Like, do I want to talk about an entrepreneur program? And then when I explain to them about the investment and then the time, and that they're going to have somebody who's going to have ownership of the business actually commit to stay in Canada after they create the business and persuade the provincial government, they have to be there on a full-time basis. Very difficult when you're running, as you would know too, multiple companies, you're on the move. You can't just station. So a lot of the other programs are a little bit fundamentally inappropriate for that scenario. You could consider potentially, if they're doing something really amazing, that startup visa could be an option. But the problem is, because they introduced on April 30th the cap where there's only 10 certificates issued per designated entity, really tough to get one of those spots. And
Mhm.
sadly, it's resulted in sort of a bidding war for those certificates. So they're really expensive. Like I've heard of some scenarios where people pay in excess of $500,000 for a certificate. So imagine,
Yeah.
a company that's done amazing, that's reinvested, they bootstrapped, and you're saying, well, maybe spend this kind of money, and then 3 years later, you might be able to get, PR. They would say, well, you really don't want me to do business in Canada. And I say, hey, I didn't make the rules. So I
Yeah.
think I'd probably be having that discussion about the ICT and seeing if it's in the chain of business growth. And then I might think about a C10. Global Talent Stream, I've had a lot of success where if the company is great and they've just incorporated and they've started to build like attraction of potential clients or letters of interest, sometimes you can still, with the right capital, get an initial GTS LMIA. I know the officers are saying, hey, we really don't like when we see startups. That's not what we were intended to do. But where you build the case and it has compelling reasons. I had one individual that came in and had $1 million of investment on the table and had done some amazing work in the Valley before, and he was well documented. And he was able to come in and bring 2 people through the Global Talent Stream as their first 2 employees. And they're up to like 40 people now, right? All
Hmm.
pretty much the exception of a handful, all Canadians, like, in tech. So you have to think strategically and you have to tell your client, especially if they're keen, that we're going to probably look at multiple options. And this will be a little challenging and manage the expectations at the beginning, because it's not like it was before where I used to, when I talk about Canada, I'd say I have the luxury. It's not just finding one option. It's which of the many options do we pick? Now it's which of
Right.
the options could work, right? Different narrative.
Right. Yeah. And it's sad. It's sad. And the other thing is now more than ever, you need that trusted immigration expert, right? Like I talk to law firms every week about adopting AI and automation. And once in a while I get the question of like, hey, is this going to replace me?
Mhm.
And I'm like, maybe one day, but the way IRCC is making these changes, you'll be fine for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Because it just navigating this ecosystem has gotten so difficult, at least since like COVID, I think,
Yeah.
right? Like if you think back to how much easier your job and my job were before COVID,
Right.
so much simpler the way everything's gone. Now, Noman, if there's an entrepreneur out there who's thinking about Canada and they've heard everything we said and they get they get the message that like, hey, it's gotten a little bit harder. We're going to probably have to evaluate multiple options. You're probably going to want a trusted immigration lawyer consultant to work with.
Yes.
What do you think someone should have as like sort of a bare minimum? Could be in terms of like entrepreneurial experience, revenue, money in their bank account. Like, if someone's out there running a $80,000 a year
Mhm.
business,
Yeah.
is this not for them? Like, what's kind of the minimum that somebody should keep in mind?
Yeah. Look, first of all, what we've seen in many of the programs for people who've entered Canada, be it students or startup visa applicants or either employees who are high skilled, when they come here, they're shocked at the costs, right? We all are.
Hmm.
I mean, think about someone that comes from another country and they're converting their currency and then they're going to buy a business. They're going to support themselves and their family. That business, as we know, when you start a new business, it may not be revenue generating for some time. So personally, I mean, I ideally, a person should have like at least I would say a couple of $1 million in a perfect scenario if they're going to buy a business. Because again, the way some of these programs, if we're talking provincial programs, the more you invest, the more points you get. So it might be that you're
Hmm.
going to have to put in $500 to $750,000 to be able to reasonably qualify if you're older and you need the points, right? And some businesses, I mean, the way of the world, not always, is usually the businesses are going to give you the best return are going to be valued higher. So you need to spend more. So really it's about understanding that person's motivation and then making sure that they have a reasonable sense of what these costs are going to look like. And I touch on your point. A lot of the problems, unfortunately, that have happened is where the lawyer or the consultant has really done a poor job or has misled the individual because they just want to, take the work and process the work. So they look for the bare minimum, but the bare minimum, is really difficult to be able to survive on. So I think one is about
Hmm.
them and their, what's your near best interest, and then work out a budget. And I've had clients where they said, look, I only have 150,000 and I'm borrowing money and, this is the plan. And I said, look, here's what the real costs are going to be. I don't think this is like advisable. Why don't you build up a little bit more of, equity and then rethink it down the road? Because those are the cases that typically, even when you present them provincially, they don't get selected because they're not attractive. And now the person's already made this emotional and professional commitment. So I think, you start by making sure that when you look at the cost of acquisition, the cost of life in Canada, that they have a reasonable amount of money and that they really measure what is the ROI. And if they're positioned to do it and they think that they've got a way to take a business and make it much better, fair enough. But I think that honest discussion builds trust in the relationship, and then you have a clear strategy as you move forward.
For sure. For sure. And that's part of why we started this podcast, was just to have reliable, trustworthy experts like yourself on the show, because there's so much of the opposite out there, right? Number one. And number two, especially for entrepreneurs, they should really listen again to what you said, which is you don't want to meet the bare minimum and then you land in Canada and you're living paycheck to paycheck and you didn't realize how expensive it was in Vancouver, Toronto, or really anywhere now. And you've got that extra financial stress too that you may not have had if you didn't kind of stretch yourself.
Right.
So I think that's great advice. One of my last questions is, if you were the minister, if you woke up tomorrow, Minister of Immigration,
Yes.
what are 2 or 3 changes? Could be, I guess, maybe more focused on the entrepreneurial stuff we talked about, but the world's your oyster. Could be other immigration related stuff. What are 2 or 3 changes that you would make?
All right. The first change, which is out there, because you're a tech guy, you'll go with me on it. When Express Entry was developed, even though we kind of stole the idea from Australia and New Zealand, it still put Canada on the map as being very progressive. It's not first come, first serve. We're being thoughtful. We're looking at a transparent system where where you stand by and large. And it's a competitive pool. It's an economic class, and we're trying to get the best and brightest for Canada. Makes sense, right? Now, what we did, I think, the ministers, they've just held on to that old innovation too long, thinking that's enough. It's not enough. The first thing I think is that if we're going to lower the numbers, if we have to, then we have to select way better, way smarter. We need to start thinking, in my mind, and this is a little bit out there, we're working on some stuff too in our office around tech, around this. I don't think it's about because Josh has 1 extra year of work experience and 1 degree more than me, that he's a better candidate for Canada necessarily. That doesn't make sense. And the work experience that I have in Canada it's not better than the work experience someone else has abroad. Let's look at what you actually did, or let's look about your DNA, your talent DNA. What about your perseverance? Are you going to come to Canada and will you stay when things get tough, or will you do what a lot of immigrants do and just run back? So I think they have to re-modernize the selection criteria. And part of it is looking at ability. And there's like some interesting things that you can do on that, which again will be a little out there, but seeing that IRCC decided to use AI anyways, then maybe looking at things like behavioral psychometric patterns and weighing aptitude and capability. I think we have to think that way. And I know that there are discussions about a more modern way of selecting people who are based on prediction more likely to be able to contribute. So I think whatever that way is, we have to start brainstorming. It can't just be measuring very blunt instruments and making decisions and hoping for the best. That's number one. Number two, I would say we really have to create processes that are unique to industries. And I know that the minister has touched on it, but I don't think it's deep enough. Like, for example, there is some talk that, although there's a shortage of housing, because there aren't as much construction projects, maybe we don't have a shortage of these skills. And so it's really not the same priority we thought. But the reality is that many companies are not bidding on projects because they can't actually do the work because there are no people. Or if they end up taking the contract and they're not able to meet timelines, the penalty provisions are so severe they go bankrupt. So you end up with like 2 or 3 players in the industry that are winning the contracts and have no people. And it's a monopoly that doesn't make any sense. And we know in 5 years that there's about 500,000 baby boomers in construction that will disappear. And let's assume that at the end of November, they reduce the immigration plan to reduce immigrants. What's going to happen in 5 years? Like, are we going to take the numbers at that point when we see that we're in emergency state and say we need to get 1.5 million immigrants in fast? And we're going to use our system that has, currently designed this way? No. So I would say I would bring an innovation task force. I would bring in industry leaders from all of the sectors under pressure. I would put money behind it. And I'd bring in, like, I would personally bring in, sophisticated consultants in an RFP, like from McKinsey and other people, and bring in experts. And I would start redoing the whole thinking around immigration on a war footing basis, because you add that whole scenario and healthcare, even worse.
Yeah.
Like cloud computing, ML, AI, cyber, equally bad, right, for Canada. And if we don't do that quickly, I think we're going to be in a major crisis, and then take automation into effect and disruption of jobs. People are going to lose their jobs because of the pace of other AI. So we'll have a lot of unemployed people and no people that can do the jobs. This is not very attractive. So I would be a very busy minister of immigration. I wouldn't be changing the ICT provisions simply. I'd be thinking of the deeper issues, but I also don't have an election to try to win. So I guess easier said than done.
Well, I think everything you said makes total sense. I've been equally of praise and criticism over Express Entry over the last few years. I think it was a great program, and I still think it has the potential to be as amazing as it was when it first came out. But like you said, the current way they do the math doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't understand why somebody with 15 years of amazing work experience gets the same points as someone with 3 years of work experience.
Right.
Or five, if it's foreign work experience, 5 years and 15 years gets the same amount of points. Doesn't make sense to me. So anyways, there's definitely room for improvement. This has been great, Naumaan. I've, number one, learned a lot, especially on the entrepreneurial side. And number two, I'm hoping a lot of our listeners do as well. What do you think? Maybe my second last question would be for folks out there like myself too, that have been a little bit concerned over the changes we're seeing over the last few years and the reputation hit that I think Brand Canada is taking as a result. What are some pieces of advice, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of advice you'd give to, could be the immigration lawyers and consultants out there that have had a harder time to practice, and aspiring immigrants that are maybe on the fence about Canada? What are 1 or 2 things you'd say to them?
Yeah, I think particularly for new practitioners, I would say reach out and make sure you have mentors. Like, it's really hard to dabble, or if you're in your first year or two, all these changes are coming. There's a lot of potential liability, and you'd find with a lot of the more experienced practitioners, we're happy to always be there as a resource, because this is tricky. Number one. Number two, and I know that, we have different associations that do a good job, but I think also there's a need for industry clients and lawyers and interested stakeholders to start coming together and helping to brainstorm the solution. And looking for people, whether it's MPs, and I guess to be strategic, you have to look at both sides now, because we don't know what the future holds, and start educating them on to how immigration can be a winning prospect. And when we're talking about economic today, how economic immigration, when placed properly, can be a driver for economic growth, and how to change the narrative. Because right now, the Brand Canada immigration narrative is taking such a hard kick that we have to really respond. Because I'm not speaking only out of self-interest. There's some there for sure. I'm an immigration lawyer, but it's more so like what I told you is coming. There is a tsunami coming. And if we don't get our political parties and the future ministers and current ministers rethinking how to do this right quickly, it's going to be a disaster. So I would say getting involved and having those discussions, and it really helps to have like a couple of anchor clients or companies or CEOs. They're going to listen to them more than, like an immigration lawyer like me. They'll listen to me for a little while too, but it's really the voice of corporate Canada that needs to speak out, and then a little bit about industry and associations about entrepreneurship and the fact that we're so traditional still. We're so far behind in all the innovative areas where the growth is going to occur. For the next generations, we are really doing a disservice if we don't think this through.
Absolutely. That's great advice. Naumaan, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been great. If anybody does want to get in touch or maybe learn more about yourself or your firm, where do you recommend that they go?
Yeah, sure. They can just look us up at www.greenberghameed.com and just our contact information's there. We'd love to speak. And thank you, Josh. I enjoyed this discussion and some of our earlier discussions. I think it's great that you're actually doing what I just suggested, which is get these issues out there, get different perspectives. And then maybe the next step is to figure out how we take sort of commonality of thought and convert that into some position papers and action items. And I'd love to work with you and other interested stakeholders on how we can try to help the system.
Absolutely. That's a great idea that maybe we'll take off air. Naumaan, thank you again for coming on the show. We will have links to the website in the description, whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or watching us on YouTube. Naumaan, thank you again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Josh.